A bit of housekeeping before we get started. I was recently a guest on a new podcast called Superstructure with Julian Field, where Julian reads stories from history to one of my favorite comedians, John Gabris. We talked about the late great Planet Earth, a truly terrible book that, despite being sort of forgotten, has helped shape your world, so go check it out. Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 32, The Messiah, Part 1. Well, gang, this is it. This is the big one. The empire we're ushering in will seem to pop up out of nowhere, and it will, in just a few decades, encompass double the geographical size of any polity we've encountered in the approximately 1,300 years of history we've covered thus far. The implications of this for the history of the development of the Bible are enormous. There's before Cyrus and after Cyrus. And yet, as we'll see, we know very little about the actual guy. But that doesn't mean we don't have lots to talk about, because despite not knowing anything about him, later writers said a whole lot about Cyrus and the era leading up to his conquest. Last time, I talked a lot about Nabonidus, the last king of Imperial Babylon, a guy who we do know a lot about. His devotion to the moon god Sin above all others, his odd path to the throne, his administrator's son Belshazzar, who he left in charge of Babylon while he was gone for 10 years. And when we left Nabonidus, he was holed up a bit north of Medina on the Arabian Peninsula, having a nice time in his little oasis quasi-capital of Tema. Today, Nabonidus comes home, creates a big-ass mess, and then faces down Cyrus in battle. Who will win? Who will lose? And how does all of this connect to a Vampire Weekend song, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, South Park, and the U.S. Postal Service? Find out more on today's suspense-filled Bible Lore podcast. Sources for this episode include, once again, Beaulieu's Reign of Nabonidus from last episode, King of the World, The Life of Cyrus the Great by Matthew Waters, and a healthy dose of good old Herodotus. As always, these and all other sources are listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description. This episode releases 2 weeks early for Patreon subscribers, and you can support the show by joining their ranks at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. Thanks to everyone who subscribes and helps keep the show going. To his own people, he was Kurush. To the Greeks, he was Kyros. And to modern-day English speakers, he's Cyrus the Great. I'll go with Kyros because most of our sources here are Greek. In order to do Kyros' story justice, we need to rewind a bit and talk about what was going on east and north of our Babylonian Empire over the last century or so. I've often omitted discussing the politics of these outer reaches of recorded history in detail for a few reasons. In part because it's already a whole lot of ground to cover in discussing Mesopotamia and Syria and Palestine. That's a tall order. And the Fertile Crescent makes a nice boundary marker, surrounded as it is by mountains and deserts. On top of that, the written record becomes spotty at best once you leave Egypt and Mesopotamia, with entire pre-Bronze Age collapse writing systems that still haven't been deciphered. We still live in the shadow of the collapse, frankly. We're not out of the woods yet. But we're eventually going to have to get into Greece, including the Balkans and Turkey, and then into Italy. So today we'll be embiggening our world. We'll be moving beyond our beloved Tigris and Euphrates and Jordan and Nile rivers to talk about Armenia and Iran and Kurdistan and even a bit of Anatolia. They can all have their day in the sun. The history is a bit patchier and fragmentary, but even now progress is being made specifically in ancient Iran. A couple weeks ago, it was announced that the linear Elamite script found in Iranian archaeological sites and which had long remained a tough nut to crack was finally deciphered by a French archaeologist working in Belgium. In a clever trick, he searched for and found the name of a king known from Mesopotamian documents as a point of comparison due to it having a doubled syllable, one king Shilhaha, who ruled around 100 years before Hammurabi. From these two syllables, he was able to discover more symbols, and a slow process of basic understanding is now underway. Right now, there are essentially real-time updates being posted about new symbols the team has managed to decipher. It is an incredible time to get into this ancient history, but the recency of this remarkable feat means it will be years before we can understand the history more thoroughly, and unfortunately our pool of texts is not nearly as large as Mesopotamia. Additionally, these texts are also from a script that died out by the end of the Bronze Age, so they won't help us much in our present moment. Still cool as hell, but this means that I can't talk in much detail about the late Bronze Age in Iran, except through the Mesopotamian lens we've had to rely on up to this point. Their history was doubtless as rich and fascinating as everything we've seen, but so much of what we know is only because it can be compared to more abundant Mesopotamian sources, which is a damn shame. That uncertainty also extends deep into the Iron Age. You will often see discussions of, for example, a Median empire to Babylon's east, a vast array of kingdoms united under a central banner in Iran. But Waters, in his book on Cyrus, notes that characterizing this as an empire is kind of fraught. Because of this, I get to tear through a lot of patchy history. There will be a whole lot of names today. I'll try to keep it all clear, but you may want to look at some maps for this one just to refresh yourself on locations like northwest Iran and Azerbaijan and Turkey and that, general region. I'll link a couple of maps in the episode description if you absolutely need to follow along that way, and I hope that general references to modern-day nation-state borders can help us at least a little bit. Let me know how it goes. What I've written ahead is a retelling of especially the last 100 years of history before the mid-500s, focusing on big political shakeups because that instability characterizes this era. Scholars call the period we're currently in the middle of, the Babylonian and early Persian period, the long 6th century. I personally think the 7th century has just as much to offer, hence my cheeky miniseries title for that era that I stretch into the early 8th. But really, so much of our political quagmire still goes back to Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. The instability of the end of his rule has never left us. It's like the dominoes falling after the American Revolution, resulting in stuff like repeated French revolutions and then the mass European uprisings of the mid-19th century. It's this mechanical watch movement of wheels turning and springs unwinding, and it can be confusing to understand, so don't worry if you can't keep up. Just sit back, crack a cold one, and say a thank you to the goddess Ninkasi. On to our grand opera. Iranian settlement had been a bit more sparse than the lush Indus Valley and Fertile Crescent civilizations that bordered the mountainous region, but it also served as a natural bridge between these locations, so the urban settlement characteristic of those more famous early civilizations had been pretty consistent for the entire Bronze Age. There was writing, trade, and a whole lot else that has largely been lost to us in any detail. We know that Elamites based out of Susa eventually sacked Babylon and took a stela of Hammurabi's code in the late Bronze Age, if you'll recall from our very first episode. Susa remains one of the oldest cities in the world. Today it's called Shush. It's about 160 miles east of the Euphrates River, 250 kilometers for my non-American or British listeners, and it lies near the foothills of the Zagros Mountains along the eastern edge of the Mesopotamian Plateau. This made it a sort of natural boundary marker, a gateway to the mountains, and it also opened it up to raiding by semi-nomadic peoples, like those who conquered Babylon before Hammurabi's time, or those who conquered many parts of Syria and Jordan and Palestine. Banditry was kind of a fact of life, but so was imperial expansion or attempts at conquest by neighboring kingdoms, so, everyone justifies their way of life however they need to. Beyond the Bronze Age collapse, Susa continued to be a pretty normal city like Babylon or Nineveh, albeit a bit smaller and never quite holding the center of power that those great cities did. Here I'm going to recap mostly the 7th century BCE, but with a lot more focus on foreign policy and international affairs than when we initially dipped into this period, when we were discussing the Assyrian and Babylonian history that was primarily relevant to our Judahites and Israelites. This is a Bible podcast after all. Tiglath-Pileser III turned Assyria into a bona fide empire in the mid-8th century, but his son Shalmaneser V was overthrown by Sargon II, right around the time Shalmaneser was campaigning in Samaria and destroying the Israelite state, bringing it under direct Assyrian rule, a fight that Sargon appears to have finished with requisite brutality. Sargon's son Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem for engaging in similar rebellions to their northern cousins, and afterward he switched out his own heir apparent for Esarhaddon, Assyria's next king, who would pull a similar move with his own sons Shamash-shuma-ukin and Ashurbanipal, and he had had his big succession oath treaty thing promulgated far and wide, influencing the writers of Deuteronomy. You remember all that, right? That brings us to where we really start our retelling, with our old librarian pal Ashurbanipal, whose reign was nearly 40 years long. Ashurbanipal, as a typical Assyrian king, married his niece off to the Scythian king Madius, who ruled over West Asia in the Caucasus, parts of northwest Iran and Armenia and Azerbaijan, up into southeast Turkey. All of that southern Caucasus region was broadly held by the Scythians, the areas north of modern Syria and Iraq. Ashurbanipal faced revolts from Elam and eventually Babylon, and he called on his Scythian connections to support him in his campaigns to the east especially, allowing Scythian expansion even further into northwest Iran as a prize for helping him destroy Susa and killing its king. Cimmerians from the southern parts of the Scythian highlands, Medes and Persians from further inland Iran, Chaldeans and other tribes from southern Iraq, seemingly everyone mustered troops to try and topple Ashurbanipal, and none of it worked. He was a king that kind of sucked, but who nobody could get rid of. Herodotus says he likewise killed a Median king named Phraaortes, who would have been a bit north of Susa, if he existed. That's a big if. See, the problem with this is that the only source for this is Herodotus himself, and Herodotus was being called a top-tier bullshit artist by people who were alive at the same time as him, as we'll see today. Perhaps all he had was the guy's name and the fact of his death. Regardless of the particulars, the brutal campaign initially succeeded in pacifying the east, at least leaving it manageable for the rest of Ashurbanipal's reign. But destroying the Elamite state was a Pyrrhic victory at best in the long run. Susa, like Babylon, wasn't fully destroyed despite Ashurbanipal's bragging, though it was sacked and some buildings were burned down and its king was killed and its elites were gone. But people still lived there, and people still do live there. For the moment, though, things had been quieted down through the application of mass imperial violence once again. Our friend Ashurbanipal also engaged in more typical Iron Age diplomacy, and so royal hostages were taken during the campaign. Tribute was paid by kings in the region, as the librarian emperor put it. Here's Waters' citation of an Ashurbanipal inscription from Nineveh. Quote, "Cyrus, the king of Parsumash, heard about my victory. He became aware of the might I wielded with the aid of Ashur, Bel, and Nabu, the great gods my lords, with which I leveled the whole of Elam like a flood. He sent Aruku, his eldest son, with his tribute to Nineveh, the city of my lordship, to pay homage to me. He implored my lordship." And it's possible, though uncertain, that this Cyrus is Cyrus the First, grandfather of Cyrus the Second, our far more famous guy. The names are a match, but the ages seem a little problematic. It's not impossible, but the king must have been middle-aged or even old when his son, Cyrus the Great's father Cambyses, was born, and likewise for Cambyses' age when Cyrus the Great was born. So if this is Cyrus the First being referenced, it would have been Cyrus the Great's uncle Aruku, who was sent to Nineveh to serve in the court and act as both leverage and a diplomatic channel for the emperor, a guarantor of Ashurbanipal's peace. But eventually, as all kings do, the Assyrian emperor died, and the empire rapidly began to unravel. Wars began to erupt in earnest in the decade after Ashurbanipal's death in 631. People had gotten tired of harsh Assyrian rule, and it created perfect conditions for local revolts to turn into more organized attacks on the Assyrian state. A term used by Ashurbanipal and many others disparagingly against the Easterners was umanmanda, meaning something akin to barbarian in the late Roman Empire, what Waters calls the stereotypical boogeyman of royal propaganda. But these were not the uncivilized Manda of Assyrian propaganda. They were sophisticated societies with cities and political dynasties and the potential to make weapons and outfit armies. We're familiar with the Chaldean king Nabopolassar, the administrator turned general turned emperor. The Median tribes and cities were united at some point in the last decades of the 7th century under, according to Herodotus, possibly fictional King Phraaortes' very real son Cyaxares, pronounced something like Shuvaxtra in Old Iranian. In 626 BCE, 5 years after Ashurbanipal's death, Nabopolassar's Chaldean revolt from the south against Nineveh began in earnest, plunging the region into a war that would plague it for 20 years. The next year, while Assyria was in chaos, Cyaxares took his shot at Scythia. Without the assistance of the Assyrians, the northern kingdom was in deep shit. Cyaxares and his Median army drove them back from northwest Iran and, according to Herodotus, killed a host of their royal house, perhaps even King Madius himself, at a banquet to which they had been invited. Despite the brutality of this act, this is how Herodotus introduces it, quote, "During the 28 years of Scythian supremacy in Asia, violence and neglect of law led to absolute chaos. Apart from tribute arbitrarily imposed and forcibly exacted, they behaved like mere robbers, riding up and down the country and seizing people's property." And that might reflect real policies or at least a real attitude towards Scythian semi-nomadic rule. The horse people could just sort of show up at your door and fuck your shit up, academically speaking, whenever they wanted. The more urban kings could do that too, even if they justified it differently, so I'm not sure the difference is as great as he's making it. Additionally, contra Herodotus, the Scythians had ruled Asia, at least parts of West Asia, for a lot longer than 28 years. They'd had significant control over lands outside of Elam and Media for decades and decades before Ashurbanipal even. Continuing, at last Cyaxares and the Medes invited the greater number of them to a banquet, at which they made them drunk and murdered them, and in this way recovered their own former power and dominion. They captured Nineveh. The story of the capture I will relate in another place, and subdued the Assyrians, all except the territory belonging to Babylon. And yeah, that's our boy Herodotus, always giving a nice, neat ending to what were often far more complex affairs. In this case, I don't buy that there wasn't a protracted war between Media and Scythia, and the whole inviting them to a feast and then killing them thing seems a bit like folklore, though those types of events do sometimes actually happen. But it's all we really have, because Herodotus, as far as anyone knows, never actually published his history of Assyria, which really is a damn shame. Oh well. Specifically at issue with Herodotus is that many of the particulars of what he recounts for this period do not comport with the Babylonian Chronicle, which is a much more contemporary source and generally thought to be far more reliable on these topics. Unfortunately, the Chronicle is, as I've mentioned before, rather sparse in details of military campaigns and international politics. However, it does tell us of an alliance between Nabopolassar and Cyaxares, known in Akkadian as Waxatar. But there's something curious here. If the Chronicles section on this period dates from Nebuchadnezzar or even Nabopolassar's reign, it refers to Cyaxares, one-time ally to the rebellious Chaldeans, as Manda, the barbarian term mentioned earlier. Even the Medians who are on the Babylonian side can't catch a break. According to significantly later Greek sources, Cyaxares married one of his daughters, Amidus, off to Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, and the great king of Babylon built his famous hanging gardens to cure her homesickness. How nice. Anyway, by 612, the Medians had taken Nineveh, sacking the city and looting it with glee. Over the following decades, Cyaxares continued warring into Asia, resulting in a competing claim over eastern Anatolia with the kingdom of Lydia, which occupied most of what is now western Turkey, especially the crucial coastal cities that had entered into their sphere under King Aliatus. See, with the Scythians out of the way, this had created a lovely power vacuum that acted like bait for neighboring kingdoms, and the wealthy merchant kingdom of Lydia was well equipped to move on this emerging opportunity. So let's talk about Aleatus and the Lydians, another player in our story. Aleatus, Herodotus says, was involved in some kind of altercation with the Ionians on the Turkish coast, reaching what seems to have been some sort of general agreement and bringing these city-states under Lydian influence. With that, he was probably the first king to issue Ionian-made coins as currency. Yes, the invention and first use of coins is happening around this time too. Everything is going on all at once as the regional economic system hits new heights and undergoes new challenges. The 7th and 6th centuries are jam-packed with stuff like this. These early coins were rather crude, initially stamped out of an alloy called electrum, which is a naturally occurring mix of gold and silver and some other metals, though this shifted to more traditional silver and gold alloyed coins as minting technology became more advanced and, able to actually forge consistent alloys from gold and silver. Aleatus' maneuvering transformed Lydia from an also-ran into a serious regional threat, and he allegedly turned his attention east, toward the Armenian highlands. Here's where we dip back into the Herodotus weeds, and this one is pretty fun. According to our Greek history fella, Cyaxares and Aleatus came to a head sometime in the early 6th century. In the overall chronology, this is set decades after the end of the Great Regional War that toppled Assyria and put Nabonidus and then Nebuchadnezzar on the throne. Elsewhere, though, Herodotus says that Cyaxares was dead by this point, so that seems to be more accurate, probably. Anyway, let's just press forward. He says that one day some Scythian nomads found themselves in regions controlled by Cyaxares, presumably northwest Iran or Azerbaijan. Cyaxares, despite having driven Scythian rule out of his own lands, likes the cut of these nomads' jib. Quote, Cyaxares at first respected their dependents and treated them kindly, and even valued them so far as to make them guardians of some boys, whom they were to teach their language and the use of the bow. Now, as time went on, it so happened that the Scythians, who were continually out hunting and continually bringing in game, one day came home empty-handed. Cyaxares, who was, as he showed, a quick-tempered man, received them with insult and abuse. The Scythians, in revenge for treatment which they considered undeserved, decided to kill one of their young pupils, chop him up, dress the pieces in the ordinary way like meat, serve them to Cyaxares as a dish of game, and then make the best of their escape to the court of Aleatus in Sardis. This they actually did. Cyaxares and the guests at his table ate some of the meat, and the Scythians escaped to Sardis and threw themselves on the mercy of Aleatus. This story is, on its face, a bit silly. It's also not the last time this episode that we will encounter Herodotus using the motif of somebody surreptitiously serving human meat as revenge against a slight.
They're here, my lord. They weren't easy to carve. Especially Black Waldo.
When the nomads subsequently flee to Lydia and are sheltered by the king, this causes Cyaxares and Aleatus to go to war, a war that is finally ended 5 years later when, in 585, an eclipse blocks out the entire sun and, seeing it as a bad omen, the two kings decide to call it off. According to Herodotus, one of the founding sages of Greece, Thales, had predicted the eclipse, and for many years folks have attempted to find this eclipse and figure out how Thales could have predicted it. Lo and behold, there was an eclipse in 585 that would have hit part of Turkey where fighting may have been occurring, but it's also possible that none of this happened and the story was made up later, perhaps based on memories of that real eclipse. Isaac Asimov, famous overrated sci-fi author and sex pest and notably bad historian of the ancient past, believed that the seer Thales had indeed predicted the eclipse and made some big fuss about how this was the birth of science and modern history and blah blah blah. Do not take that shit seriously. Asimov was just talking out of his ass. The Babylonians were the absolute goats of ancient math and astronomy, with phenomenally detailed charts and tables of star and planetary positions, and still they had nowhere near the data or the cosmological understanding to have predicted an eclipse. I do not buy it. Joshua 10 contains a story that biblical apologists likewise attempt to connect to historical eclipses. In fact, an article from Smithsonian's website claims it's the earliest witness to a specifically dated solar eclipse taking place near the end of the 13th century BCE, supposedly. Part of their support for this comes from a claim that a reference to the sun having stopped in the passage could have meant something more like stopped shining. That all sounds really compelling if you don't actually read the context of the passage, where it's said that the sun has been stopped in the sky for several hours so that the soldiers do not have to stop fighting and can finish their rout of the opposing army. They need more sun. That doesn't really fit with the brevity of eclipses, and much more importantly, it also defeats the entire purpose of the story. So why the fuck is it on Smithsonian's website and other supposedly scientific sites and the Jerusalem Times? Okay, that last one actually makes sense. Scratch that. Anyway, both Cyaxares and Aliatus died around 585, before or after this eclipse battle supposedly took place, and their sons took over. For the ascendant Median kingdom in Iran, the crown fell to Astyages. And for the Lydians of Anatolia, they would be ruled by one of the most famous men from Herodotus's tales, Croesus. Both Astyages and Croesus would be the last kings of their respective kingdoms. Herodotus even says they were brother-in-laws. Brothers-in-law? Maybe that's true. Maybe one married the other's sisters to end the war between their fathers. Perhaps that's the reality behind our historian's fanciful tale. Astyages is where we finally get to talk about Cyrus. This is where Herodotus really gets to shine as a storyteller. According to him, one day Astyages has a troubling dream. Astyages had a daughter named Mandani, with two N's in the middle, not an M like Mr. Mandami. And in his dream, Mandani pisses so hard and so much that it, quote, filled his city and swamped the whole of Asia. Astyages is troubled by what his dream interpreters, the Magi, elucidate from the dream, but he figures it must be important, so he marries Mandani off to an important Persian man he respects named Cambyses. But not long after their wedding, Astyages has another dream, quote from Book 1 of Histories. This time it was that a vine grew from his daughter's private parts and spread over Asia. As before, he told the interpreters about this dream, and then sent for his daughter, who was now pregnant. When she arrived, he kept her under strict watch, intending to make away with her child, for the fact was that the Magi had interpreted the dream to mean that his daughter's son would usurp his throne. Astyages has Harpagus, one of his own kin who is in charge of his property, secrete the baby away, instructing him to kill it through exposing the infant to the elements and then giving the corpse a royal burial. Harpagus says he'll do it, but upon seizing the baby and bringing it home to his wife, he confesses that he cannot bring himself to do it, and he is unwilling to even have one of his servants kill the infant, fearing that Mandani might one day ascend to the throne of Media herself. Instead, without revealing the baby's true identity, he hands it off to one of Astyages' slaves, a herdsman named Mithridates. The herdsman rushes home from his meeting with Harpagus, and as he sprints in, he recounts what's happened, telling his wife that he's also ascertained the truth about the infant's identity. His wife bursts into tears, quote, "My own child," she said, "was born today, and it was born dead. Take the body and expose it, and let us bring up Mandani's son as our own. If we do this, no one will find out that you have disobeyed your masters. Moreover, we shall have managed pretty well for ourselves too. Our dead baby will have a royal burial, and this one will not be killed." Mithridates is pleased by the scheme, and they carry it out, letting Harpagus recover their own dead child. The motif in this story is probably one of the most famous in all of literary history, known as the exposed infant motif. Sargon the Great, Moses, the Gospel of Matthew's baby Jesus, and Rome's legendary founders, Romulus and Remus, all eventually had versions of this motif incorporated into their biographies. Matthew's vision especially seems similar not just to the Moses story, but also the birth of Cyrus, considering the inclusions of figures like the Magi as dream interpreters found in both stories. And it is, of course, Cyrus who is the threat to Astyages, the king's own grandson through his daughter, the piss and the vine flowing out of her genitals that will overwhelm the far reaches of the earth. In Herodotus' retelling, the ruse is revealed when Cyrus is 10, quote, "He and some other boys were playing the game of kings in the street of the village, where Mithridates kept his oxen, and it so happened that Cyrus, the supposed son of the herdsman, was the one whom the boys picked as their king. In the course of their game, he was giving his subjects their various tasks, some to build houses, others to be his bodyguard, one to be the king's eye, and another to be his messenger, when one of the players, who happened to be the son of a distinguished Mede called Artembarus, refused to do what King Cyrus commanded, and Cyrus ordered his arrest. The other boys accordingly seized him, and Cyrus beat him savagely with a whip." End quote. This, as you can imagine, infuriates the rich boy's father, who brings Cyrus and Mithridates before Astyages for punishment. But upon seeing this supposed slave's child and hearing him begin to speak in his own defense, Astyages quickly discerns the boy's true identity, his own grandson. The king demands that the boy's father explain himself, and Mithridates briefly attempts to claim he is really the father until Astyages threatens torture, at which point he confesses. The king quickly forgets Mithridates and instead focuses on the man he knows is guilty of the incompetence that led to Cyrus's survival. His property steward, Harpagus, who'd been charged with the killing in the first place. He has Harpagus dragged in front of him, and when the man sees the herdsman he'd delivered the baby to 10 years ago, Harpagus realizes the jig is up, confesses on the spot, detailing his reasoning for defying the king's orders. Astyages calms himself and states that he had himself been aggrieved by the thought of murdering his own grandson, and is in fact fine with how things turned out. From Herodotus, quote, "And now," he said, "since things have taken this lucky turn, I want you to send your own son to visit the young newcomer, and come to dinner with me yourself, as I intend to celebrate my grandson's deliverance by a sacrifice to the gods, to whom such rights belong." As soon as he reached home, he sent his son, his only son, a boy of about 13 years old, to Astyages' palace, with instructions to do whatever the king should command. Then in high glee, he told his wife everything that had occurred. When Harpagus' son arrived at the palace, Astyages had him butchered, cut up into joints and cooked, roasting some, boiling the rest, and having the whole properly prepared for the table. Dinner time came, and the guests assembled, with Harpagus amongst them. Dishes of mutton were placed in front of Astyages and everybody else, except Harpagus. To Harpagus was served the flesh of his son, all of it except the head, the hands, and the feet, which had been put separately on a platter covered with a lid. When Harpagus thought he had eaten as much as he wanted, Astyages asked him if he had enjoyed his dinner. He answered that he had enjoyed it very much indeed, whereupon those whose business it was to do so brought in the boy's head, hands, and feet in the covered dish, stood by Harpagus' chair, and told him to lift the lid and take what he fancied. Harpagus removed the cover and saw the head, and saw the fragments of his son's body. As he kept control of himself and did not lose his head at the dreadful sight, Astyages asked him if he knew what animal it was whose flesh he had eaten. "I know, my lord," was Harpagus' reply, "and for my part, may the king's will be done." He said no other word, but took up what remained of the flesh and went home, intending, I suppose, to bury all of it together, and that was how Harpagus was punished.
Jesus Christ, dude!
And that, folks, is a motif that will eventually find its way into the first-century Roman writer Seneca's tragedy, Thyestes, and then into Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, and then, eventually, into the classic South Park episode Scott Tenorman Must Die, where Eric Cartman feeds another bully's parents to him in a bowl of chili as revenge.
I made you eat your parents.
This is why I'm not skipping over this stuff, not just because the story of Jesus fleeing from Herod the Great bears striking similarities to parts of this story, but also because Herodotus is just such a damn good storyteller. Did any of this happen? Almost certainly not. No way. We don't really know much about Cyrus's early life. Even the presence of the Magi in the early part of this story is potentially anachronistic. They're present in the Median king's court, and yet they seem especially associated with Persia, but not even with Cyrus, actually with Darius. or Darius, his son-in-law who eventually ascends to the throne in a whole coup rigmarole we'll get into in an episode or two. Darius was clearly a big fan of Zarathustra and that whole deal, but with Cyrus it's far less clear. We just don't know much about him. Was he actually related to Astyages? Maybe, but we have nothing outside of Herodotus with which to compare this, and it makes it essentially impossible to argue about until better evidence comes along, if it comes along. So instead, we get Herodotus's colorful tales of eating human flesh. We do know that Cyrus likely originated from the southern region of Persia, encompassing much of the modern Fars province of Iran. In fact, those two words are basically the same. P's and F's are closely related cousins in most of the languages of the broader Middle East, hence Palestine and Philistine and Philistine all being essentially the same word. Farsi is pretty much the same word as Persian or Parthian, Iran, and Aryanam. And yes, that has the same root word as Aryan, because Indo-European culture and people seem to have migrated, perhaps from up in Ukraine or southern Russia, down to Greece, Turkey, Armenia, Iran, and Pakistan. This means that there is some commonality in language, and as we'll see when we get to the Greeks, commonality in mythology and culture between these peoples, even after they've been separated by centuries. For Persia especially, the 7th and 6th centuries are when we seem to get a lot more evidence for Zoroastrianism. But I'm not going to talk about it today because, again, we just don't have the evidence for Cyrus being a Zoroastrian, at least not to the degree that his successors were. So where was he born? Where did he grow up? What did Cyrus do before taking the throne? He had at least one wife, the legendary Cassandani, likely more wives, and a handful of kids. Perhaps he had been a petty king under Astyages, or a city administrator like Nabopolassar. That sounds good. Whoever he was before this point, he led a revolt against Astyages somewhere around 550 BCE that reshaped the political borders of all of West Asia. According to Herodotus, it was Harpagus himself who Astyages put in charge of the army that was supposed to go and meet Cyrus in battle, which, sure, man, yeah, it definitely makes sense to put the guy whose son you fed to him in charge of putting down a revolt by the guy he was supposed to kill decades before but didn't. Sure. Supposedly, this led to a quick defeat of Astyages as Harpagus immediately defected, and many of his best soldiers followed him. Thus did Cyrus the Great swiftly conquer Media, allegedly. Eventually, though, Herodotus tells us that Cyrus pressed on past northwest Iran and set his sights on a bigger prize, Lydia. The Lydian king Croesus, of course, is him of rich as Croesus fame.
She's richer than Croesus, she's tougher than leather.
Now, before you get confused, this is Alyatus's son, Croesus, the famously wealthy Anatolian king who loses to the Achaemenid-era Persians, not Crassus, the famously wealthy Roman general who loses to the Parthian-era Persians. Totally different famous rich guys. Croesus, like Alyatus before him, is described as being a rather generous patron of the famous Temple of Apollo at Delphi. This is almost certainly true. But despite being closer to Herodotus geographically, Croesus in his work is still more of a literary figure than a real guy. But as with Astyages, the story is so much fun and so influential, so let's tell it. As the story goes, the wealthy Croesus wants to attack Cyrus for overthrowing Astyages, his brother-in-law. To figure out what he should do, he tests the various oracles at temples operating around Turkey and Greece, and when he finds the oracle of Apollo's temple at Delphi to be the only valid and legitimate seer who can answer his query accurately, he sends the temple enormous quantities of sacrifices and luxury goods to elevate their status and show his appreciation. Again, Alyatus probably did this too, and their patronage of the temple was likely the source of Delphi's later prominence and fame, but Herodotus basically puts it all on Croesus. The Lydian king, having furnished the temple with luxury, then has his emissaries ask the seers a couple of questions. Quote, Croesus, king of Lydia and other nations, in the belief that these are the only true oracles in the world, has given you gifts such as your power of divination deserves, and now asks you if he should march against Persia, and if it would be wise to seek an alliance. To this question both oracles returned a similar answer. They foretold that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire, and they advised him to find out which of the Greek states was the most powerful, and to come to an understanding with it. And so the trap is laid, as the comment that he would destroy a great empire fools the hubris-prone Croesus. Quote, Croesus was overjoyed when he learned the answer which the oracles had given, and was fully confident of destroying the power of Cyrus. To express his satisfaction, he sent a further present to Delphi of 2 gold staters for every man, having first inquired how many men there were. Of course, the audience knows that the great empire that will be destroyed is not Persia, but in fact, Croesus' own. Perhaps there's some wisdom there. I don't know.
Somebody had to do it. I am the chosen one.
But that war would not come for several years. So let's check back in on Nabonidus in Babylon. Remember Babylon? Yeah, they're still there, kind of. Last time I mentioned the death of Adad-Gupi, Nabonidus' nearly century-old mother. Beaulieu notes the oddity that the queen mother died at a military camp in northern Syria, far away from the capital, with scholars speculating as to just what drew her out into the sticks. There are, as I see it, 2 distinct possibilities for what had led Adad-Gupi and her grandson Belshazzar up north. One is that they were guarding against a potential invasion by Cyrus's forces, which is plausible enough. The other is that Belshazzar's forces had joined the kingdom of Lydia in fighting against the Persians. This latter theory, that at some point Babylon joined in on the fray, has 2 things going for it, even if we can't know what happened for sure. First, the section in the Nabonidus Chronicle for the year before Adad-Gupi died, the 9th year of Ashurbanipal's reign, is conspicuously blank. Not broken. Blank. Typically, if records of a year's events were lost to a copyist, he would put in a generic bit about how, well, the records were lost for the year, or some similar stock phrase commenting on how the tablet was broken, similar to what scholars do today. Not here, though. And that sticks out like a sore thumb. And since our copies of these records come from the Persian period, likely from just a few decades after Nabonidus' reign came to an end, around the reign of Darius, it's possible that we have a little bit of a cover-up going on, another ancient redaction of embarrassing details. It at least seems more likely that that's what happened than the record of that year becoming broken or otherwise unrecoverable in such a short period of time, then falling into the hands of a scribe who used a non-standard way of communicating it had been lost. The second support for Belshazzar supporting Lydia's defenses in Anatolia is that Herodotus kind of says that they were allied. That's right, we left him behind for 2 minutes, but he's back. And perhaps by reading his work carefully, we can figure out what happened with Adad-Gupi in northern Syria. Croesus, following the oracle, makes his alliance with Sparta, as the oracles told him to, something that is likely based in historical fact, coming around the time that Adad-Gupi died in 544. From Herodotus' perspective, it's Croesus who decides to attack Cyrus, but in reality, it's possible that this was entirely defensive and that Cyrus was pressing west of his own volition. But this first campaign season did not go Croesus' way, and the king went home for the year frustrated. Quote from Herodotus, Croesus laid the blame for his lack of success upon the size of his army, which in that engagement was much smaller than the army of Cyrus. So when on the next day Cyrus did not advance to the attack, he marched back to Sardis with the intention of calling upon the Egyptians to assist him according to the pact which he had concluded with King Amasis before the treaty of alliance with Sparta. He meant also to summon the Babylonians, for with them too, under their king Nabonidus, he had previously formed an alliance, and lastly, to call upon the Lacedaemonians to join him on a definite date. And so, perhaps, the missing year of 546 or 545 had been a year of alliance with Lydia. Perhaps this is when Nabonidus' forces, under Belshazzar's command, had joined in on the fighting, something that later Persians thought shameful and thus had stricken from the official records of post-Chaldean Babylon. That sounds reasonable, if unprovable. This time around, though, No such support for Croesus from Babylon appears plausible, making the presence of Adad-Gupi in the north at the time of the Queen Mother's death even more conspicuous. Perhaps it was here, right as Adad-Gupi was dying, that some sort of truce between Babylon and Persia was drawn up, allowing passage of Cyrus's forces through the southern corridor into Anatolia. Croesus was in deep shit. In Herodotus' telling, the king's messengers go far and wide, calling for allies as the campaign season comes to a close after the big climatic battle, but Cyrus decides to press on into the winter. He immediately rides ahead, quote, "Indeed, he was his own messenger, for so swift was his advance into Lydia that Croesus had no news that he was on the way." The Persians were, Herodotus later says, famed for their speed, exemplified best by their tightly managed horse and rider courier network. The Greek historian's description of the highly efficient Persian courier service has given us a quote you may be familiar with, in part at least. "No mortal thing travels faster than these Persian couriers. The whole idea is a Persian invention, and it works like this. Riders are stationed along the road, equal in number to the number of days the journey takes, a man and a horse for each day. Nothing stops these couriers from covering their allotted stage in the quickest possible time, neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness. The first, at the end of his stage, passes the dispatch to the second to the third, and so on along the line, as in the Greek torch race, which is held in honor of Hephaestus. And, as many of us know, an unofficial slogan for the U.S. Postal Service paraphrases a turn-of-the-century translation of this passage. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. So this description of Cyrus acting as his own courier is high praise indeed. He basically puts him as the embodiment of speed and worthy of a title bestowed on mail carriers, the real heroes of our modern society. With some emergency reinforcement, Croesus is able to mount a decent-sized defensive force, larger than Cyrus's forward divisions, and the date is set for the battle. What happens next is where we get to talk about the first recorded reception of the works of Herodotus. After publishing his work, Herodotus will be subject to two almost immediate criticisms, both along the same lines. First, famously, is Thucydides, a Persian-era historian whose one surviving work will be discussed in a couple of episodes, and he thinks a certain unnamed historian bullshits too much. Thucydides admits he fills in what he thinks people said on the battlefield, but he tries to stick to what he can know actually happened without appeals to legend or fable for the most part. Many scholars think that this remark is aimed at Herodotus. The second Herodotus hater is a Greek author who actually lived and worked in the court of a later Persian king. That's Ctesias, and he called Herodotus out directly, calling him a teller of tall tales. Unfortunately, we do not have any extant copies of Ctesias's works, despite so many later authors quoting from them and summarizing parts of them. Yes, that's happening again, and it's a goddamn shame because finding a copy of Persica would be a holy grail for scholarship. At least we have the quotes and summaries, though. From these fragmentary sources, we are told that his rendition of the invasion of Cyrus involved multiple legends about the king or one of his generals setting up an army of wooden soldiers, a straw army, that spooks the Lydian forces and causes them to flee into the hills, allowing the Persians, who had fewer numbers, to attack their retreat and overwhelm the Lydian forces. There's a suspiciously similar story in the Hebrew Bible. In Judges 7, God tells the heroic leader Gideon that he has too many troops as he's waiting to attack a Midianite force that already has far greater numbers than his paltry bunch. Gideon pares his numbers down accordingly, but Yahweh tells him it's still too many, so Gideon narrows it down even further to just 300 guys.
This is Sparta!
From there, the Israelites create a ruse, scattering the remaining men in the evening, each with a lamp and a horn and a jar they can break for added noise. All at once, all of them light their lanterns and break their jars and blow their horns, and, in the confusion, the Midianites, thinking they've been overwhelmed by a massive force, flee, and Gideon's men hunt them down. Hey, now that all sounds kind of familiar. In his commentary to his wonderful translation of this passage, scholar Robert Alter questions whether a small historical kernel may lie behind this extraordinary tale, something about a smaller force overwhelming a large force. I beg to differ. I think it's clear that this entertaining story was popular even by the middle of the Persian period and could be adapted pretty freely. Herodotus tells the tale of Croesus' invasion of Lydia differently from Theseus, and while it's also likely not historical, this is one where I do wonder if it has a historical basis, because according to Herodotus, Cyrus brought along a secret weapon: camels. Cyrus rushes camels to the front to meet Croesus' cavalry, and the unfamiliar smell of these wonderful beasts spooks the Lydian horses, rendering them ineffective on the field and frightened. Having spent a fair bit of time around horses, I buy this 100%. This embarrassment presages a quick routing of the mighty kingdom. Cyrus, whether through camels or straw men or just good old-fashioned military strategy, had done it. The Assyrians and Babylons had struggled to ever gain a serious foothold in Asia Minor, controlling it primarily through an occasional request for tributary payment or the marital alliance with Scythia in Ashurbanipal's case, but not through consistent imperial stationing. These were the fringes of previous Middle Eastern empires, the fuzzy boundaries. Despite the occasional revolt, however significant they may be, Cyrus and his successors set up shop in Turkey, and it will last into the 4th century, probably around 200 years of control, based not out of Mesopotamia, but technically out of the Iranian heartland. This is one of the innovations of Cyrus and the Achaemenid Persians that will become critical to Alexander the Great, to the Romans, and really something that becomes a defining feature of pre-medieval imperialism: the roaming de facto capital. The king who isn't just gone for military campaigning season, but who is truly boundless in his de facto capital. He becomes a roaming capital. Nabonidus, had he the brilliant Persian horse courier network that made this possible, could have possibly still remained effective king of Babylon while he was out conquering Arabia. He wouldn't have had to step down. He could have just kept on expanding his boundaries. Many kings in Cyrus's wake will avoid spending too much time in the capital of their empire at all, sometimes intentionally avoiding the central cities for various reasons. Instead, the Babylonian king had undoubtedly observed, via slower but still regular official reports, Croesus' earlier expansion in Anatolia and Cyrus's conquest. In fact, we know he celebrated it, saying that it had cleared the way for him to rebuild the El-Hulhul temple in northern Syria, an area it's not even clear that the Medes actually controlled. The Uman-Manda, however real a threat they had been, were defeated. Belshazzar and Adad-Gupi made no attempt to stop Cyrus from progressing into Lydia, perhaps even offering token support to the Persian military. The motivations of many of these big political shifts are pretty straightforward. Cyrus was very clearly a gifted administrator and military commander who, over his first decades, was able to rapidly expand his empire. While we don't really know any details of how this played out, beyond the general dates of some of his campaigns, an innovative conqueror is not exactly a unique figure in our history. He was following in the footsteps of Tiglath-Pileser III, Hammurabi, Nabopolassar, folks like that. Far more irksome and confusing to me is Nabonidus' next move. The great king had been gone for 10 years and had made it clear that he was frustrated by the poor way the priests and the aristocrats had responded to the first years of his reign. In the intervening decade, the political landscape of Babylon's neighbors had shifted completely. The map was redrawn, and now, 14 years into his reign, in his mid to late 70s, maybe as old as 80, King Nabonidus packed up camp and made his way back to Mesopotamia. Baffling! Beaulieu points to mentions of a famine leading to poor crops as a potential reason for Nabonidus' return, along with perhaps disagreements about the way Belshazzar was running the kingdom, and, most probably, fears about Cyrus's growing imperial holdings. With the passage of the Persian army into Anatolia, the entire northern and eastern borders of Babylon were surrounded by Cyrus's holdings. I just don't get what Nabonidus thought he was going to do about it. One tempting datum that Beaulieu points to is a figure named Gobryas, a figure that later Greek writer Xenophon claims was an eastern governor under an unnamed Babylonian emperor, presumably Nabonidus. The emperor's son and successor murders Gobryas' own son and successor, leading Gobryas to aid Cyrus in his revolt against Babylon. But I'm always pretty cautious with Xenophon, who really follows in the tradition of Herodotus of filling in the gaps of history as he sees fit. But anyway, maybe there was trouble in the East already, a defection of one of Nabonidus' own governors or petty kings to the overwhelming tide of Cyrus. With his return, Nabonidus decided that he wasn't going to take no for an answer when it came to cult reform, and he began his much-delayed rebuilding of the Ahuhul temple in Haran. For a long time, scholars believed that Nabonidus had refurbished the Temple of Sin before the Tema exile, but more careful reading of inscriptions has transformed the overall chronology of his reign, particularly an inscription from Haran itself that acknowledges the delays in construction. Even more interesting is what's called the Nabonidus verse account, a piece of scathing critical propaganda written probably not long after Babylon fell. In it, the author satirically reframes Nabonidus' return in the style of typical royal inscriptions. Quote, "I will build Sin's temple. I will lay out its location. I will form its brickwork and secure its foundation. I will make the window and lock similar to the temple of Ekur, and I will call its name Ahuhul forever. When I have completed what I shall build, I will take Sin's hand and establish him in his dwelling." All well and good, much of this reads like some of the Psalms in the Torah, but then we get to the good part. Quote, "Until I have achieved this and I have attained my desire, I will neglect the festival. I will cancel the New Year's festival. He fashioned its brickwork. He formed its plan. He enlarged its foundation and made its top high. With gypsum and bitumen, he made its appearance glow. He set up in front of it a fierce bull like the ones of the Esagil. After he attained his desire, a work of falsehood, after he built an abomination, a work of unholiness, in the beginning of the 3rd year, he entrusted the military camp to his firstborn." And that sounds more like other parts of the Bible, which rage against the wickedness of kings and those who don't follow Yahweh's commands, all the talk of falsehood and unholiness. In fact, just before mentioning Cyrus in Isaiah 41, the author mocks those who worship carved images, stating that these idols have no real powers. Quote, "Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be afraid and terrified. You, indeed, are nothing, and your work is nothing at all. Whoever chooses you is an abomination." The Babylonians thought as much about Nabonidus' veneration of the moon god Sin. The king began incorporating new titles into his official name, likely rediscovered by his archaeologists digging through Mesopotamian history, which results in some real bangers. Quote, "I am Nabonidus, the great king, the strong king, king of the universe, king of Babylon, king of the 4 quarters. Big dog indeed." The anti-Nabonidus verse account continues to paint a different picture of this, instead portraying the king as a moron in his final years. Quote, "He would stand up in the assembly and praise himself. I am wise. I am knowledgeable. I have seen hidden things. Although I do not know the art of writing, I have seen secret things. The god Ilteri has made me see dreams. He has made everything known to me. I surpass in all kinds of wisdom, even the series Uskar Anum and Lila, which Adapa composed." This reads a bit like Ashurbanipal bragging about being able to read, write, and read liver omens, so maybe there was something there. But because this writing is critical, it gets pretty funny after this point. Quote, "Yet he would mix up the rites, confuse the omens. Concerning the august rituals, he would speak evil, even the plan of the Esagil, the plan which Eamumu himself had laid out. He would look at the plans and utter invectives. Once, when he saw the crescent symbol of the Esagil, he did something with his hands." There's a break in the text there, but let's press on. "He summoned the scholars and spoke with them. Whom is this temple built for? This is its symbol. If it were Bel's temple, it would be marked with the spade. Therefore, Sin has indeed marked his temple with the crescent symbol." And this is where we can so clearly see the underlying frustration. Nabonidus returned and began refashioning temples, even allegedly Marduk's great Esagil temple in Babylon itself, as sanctuaries of sin instead. That's right, he's pulling some kind of move like Akhenaten or Josiah before him, a big-ass cult reform elevating one god above the rest that doesn't seem to gain him many fans. Let's do it again, gang. Here, tragically, we have a gap in the late years of Nabonidus, but then a rather fragmentary inscription for his final year in office. Quote, "In the month," break in the text, "and the gods of Marad Zababa and the gods of Kish Dinlil and the gods of Hursag Kalama entered Babylon. Until the end of the month, Ululu, the gods of Akkad, break in the text, who are above the, break in the text, and below the, break in the text, entered Babylon. The gods of Borsippa, Kutha, break in the text, and Sippar did not enter Babylon." According to later propaganda from Cyrus, this was actually Nabonidus stealing the gods of his cities, and with the furor over his cultic reforms, perhaps this line had purchase. But most scholars today believe Nabonidus was bringing the gods into Babylon in order to protect them from Cyrus's advances. The Persians also state that they were welcomed as liberators, indeed, that there was no battle at all. Quote, "Marduk, the great lord, the protector of his people, joyfully looked at Cyrus's good deeds and at his righteous heart. He ordered him to march to his city Babylon. He made him take the road to Babylon, and marched at his side like a friend and companion. His large troops, whose number, like the waters of a river, could not be established, paraded at his side, their weapons girded on. Without combat or battle, he caused him to enter Babylon, his city. He saved Babylon from oppression. He delivered into his hands Nabonidus, the king who did not worship him." And that's not exactly accurate. Here's a quote from a contemporary Babylonian record. "In the month of Teshritu, when Cyrus did battle at Opis on the bank of the Tigris against the army of Akkad, the people of Akkad retreated. He carried off the plunder and slaughtered the people. On the 14th day of Teshritu, Sippar was captured without a battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day of Tashritu, Ugbaru, governor of Gudium, and the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle." So, piecing this together, Cyrus wrapped up his war with Lydia, set up administration of the region, and eventually, some years later, began his preparations for an invasion of Babylon, perhaps anticipating significant resistance from the heart of the once mighty empire. When he arrived in late September or early October of 539, the two armies clashed at Opis, around 50 miles north of Babylonia, near modern Baghdad, ending in a rout of the Babylonian forces. Nabonidus fled, possibly to Babylon, perhaps considering whether to retreat deeper into Mesopotamian territory and regroup like the Assyrians had done when their empire was collapsing. But he was around 80 years old, and he was tired. Would he really defend a kingdom that rejected him so many times and with such fervor? Babylon, so close to Opis, would have quickly heard the outcome of the battle. And then things got worse. The city of Sippar had surrendered without a fight. Nobody was willing to rally around the king. We have several different tales of where and when Nabonidus surrendered or was captured or was killed in battle. One tale says he survived decades longer into the reign of Darius I. I like to think he knew the jig was up, though, and handed himself over. 2 weeks after the battle at Opis, in mid-October, the Persians finally arrived at the great capital city of Babylon. Undoubtedly, the citizens of the city put on quite the show of welcoming their Persian conquerors into the capital, with some who truly hated Nabonidus and others who at least understood that the ball game was over. For the first time in at least 2,000 years of recorded history, an outsider had fully conquered Mesopotamia. We'll get into what that means for our Jerusalem deportees in the next episode as we close out the life of Cyrus the Great, but I'll leave you with a bit from Isaiah 45, quote, "Thus said Yahweh to his Mashiach," that means anointed one, "to Koresh, whose right hand I grasp, to hold sway over peoples, and the loins of kings will I loosen, to open before him double doors, and the gates shall not be closed. I will go before you, and rough places I will level, Doors of bronze I will smash, and iron bolts I will hack down. And I will set before you treasures of darkness and hidden stores, so that you may know that I am Yahweh, who calls your name, the God of Israel. To the author of this passage, probably written not long after the conquest of Babylon, Cyrus, Koresh in Hebrew, was the answer from his God to decades of prayers. And yes, you now may be realizing that David Koresh did indeed name himself after two of the most highly anointed kings in the Bible. One more reason that guy was annoying. So there we have it. A king who sprung up seemingly out of nowhere, and within a decade or so created an empire with no historical precedent. But what kind of empire would it be? And what the hell is a satrapy? Next time, Cyrus disappears. Somewhere. We explore the various reactions to his conquests, his death, the end of the exile, and maybe a bit about his son and successor Cambyses. All of this and more on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Thanks once again to all of my supporters on Patreon. You can join their ranks at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast.